Hey everyone, welcome back to week 7. This week we're going to talk exclusively about genocide. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we've also kind of touched on this last week, but I wanted to kind of bring it back to your forefront memory. So the definition of genocide is the deliberate, systematic extermination of a national or ethnic group. It's defined by intent and purpose to annihilate an entire group. So remember, you must have proven intent, and the victims are deliberately targeted. So, what does that mean? That means that genocide is not accidental. Genocide is known as the crime of crimes. Now, why would genocide be known as that? Well, genocide and the act of genocide is the most extreme form of a human rights violation because it targets an entire population of, or group of people to erase them from the society based on their national, ethnical, racial, or religious ideologies. I will say that no genocide has ever succeeded at 100% population annihilation. That's why, as we get into the conversation around how the definition was formed, it's so important to realize that in part section of genocide because uh, in part means substantial annihilation of the population. So let's look at some of the origins of genocide. We're going to talk about the man who coined the term genocide, as well as some of the international treaties that really kind of rectified and defined genocide into law. So the man on your screen right now, his name is Raphael Lemkin. And Mr. Lemkin is a very important figure in the discussion around genocide. Why? Because he was the first person to coin the term genocide. And his fascination with this dates back to his childhood. Um, During his childhood and his college experience, he learned of Armenian deaths under the Ottoman Empire. And he asked his professor about these deaths. And his professor basically told him, it's really none of our business why these deaths occurred. And it's not the business of the international community to go searching for answers. So remember, during this time, this is pre World War II, and it's pre the Geneva Convention. And so you still had this notion of national sovereignty that we talked about last week. And so his professor gave him the answer, but Raphael Lemkin didn't like that answer. And so he kind of tried to search out on his own and do some additional research. Well, he also stumbled upon an instance where an Armenian family was murdered, and the guy whose family was murdered um, during a genocide event shot and killed a Turkish general who had been the one that kind of arranged the genocide that his family was killed in. And the Armenian man who shot and killed the Turkish general was arrested. And this kind of left Limpkin baffled because the Armenian man was arrested for murdering the Turkish general who had in turn murdered the Armenian man's family. So Limpkin pondered a question that I think most of us have pondered when we think about genocide. Why is it murder to kill one person, but not murder when thousands are killed? because it wasn't considered murder back then. So, consumed with this injustice, he began studying events and laws and worked, although he was unsuccessful at this time, worked to introduce legal safeguards for ethnic, religious, and social groups at an international forum throughout the 20s and 30s. And he even had the foresight enough to kind of warn the international community about Germany, um, because he himself had to flee uh, from Germany to Poland. After World War II, he became a central figure, um, and really kind of the engine behind the international movement to define and create a law to prevent future atrocities, which would later be coined genocide. He did assist on the Nuremberg trials, where he learned of the death of 45 members of his own family during the Nuremberg trials, including his own parents, who had been murdered as a part of the Holocaust, the ultimate genocide. So, this really kind of had him working, um, and kind of ramping up his efforts, with a personal touch to it now. He helped draft the UN Convention on Genocide and advocating its passage, literally working himself to death doing so, even after its ratification. And he was the one that came up with the terminology of genocide, but also the ideology of genocide, stating that genocide, really the main premise of genocide is destruction of human groups. And that's the notion that we still go with today, and as you've seen in the final definition. So Mr. Limpkin was a key member of the fight um, to prevent genocide, and without his advocacy and his work, who knows where we would be, as far as with atrocity crimes. So now let's talk a little bit about the United Nations and their involvement in genocide. So the United Nations, as we've talked about, is a key pivotal player in the international community. It is the entity that is made up of partnerships and collaborations of different member states, to address international issues. And one of the first was addressing the issue of genocide. And they did this in 1946, through a UN resolution. Um, and the 1946 UN resolution formally recognized genocide as a crime under international law. So while it didn't officially detail genocide, it did lead to what would become the Genocide Convention, which details genocide and details the expectations around genocide for international partners. So the Genocide Convention was created in December, of 1948, December 9th, 1948 to be exact. That is a date that you will want to make sure you remember. Why? Because the Genocide Convention was signed one day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So remember the UDHR we talked about lays out the different types of rights that people have, throughout the nations. And it was really kind of a battle to develop the UDHR. And it's important to note that while they were fighting that battle for the UDHR, Limpkin and the international community was also fighting the battle on genocide and kind of, bringing that to the forefront. And genocide, won that race as far as being recognized and signed into international law before the UDHR. The Genocide Convention was the first binding human rights treaty to emerge from the post-war UN system. There were several debates around defining genocide through this convention, but they did finally land on the definition that we've already went over: the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So let's break that definition down a little bit. What do we mean by intent? So we've established that genocide is not an accidental event. There is deliberate planning and expressed purpose of annihilation, right? The perpetrators will deliberately choose their victims. They will deliberately choose the killing or annihilation standards for which they will go forth to do. As part of this definition, notice that there are only 4 protected classes. The only 4 protected classes for genocide in international law is national, ethnical, racial, and religious classes. Those are the only protected entities or protected groups. Finally, I told you, remember that no genocide has been completely 100% successful in total annihilation. So this in whole or in part portion of the definition is very important. Partial destruction warrants a genocide charge based on international court standards. Partial destruction, as laid out by the court, means that a substantial portion of the population has been annihilated for either national reasons, ethnical reasons, racial reasons, or religious reasons. Okay? Hope that makes sense. We've gone over the methods of genocide. I do have those listed on the slideshow. You can look at those, but it's really kind of, think of the Holocaust when you think of genocide. It's the mass killing, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about a person or a group's physical destruction in whole or in part. Preventing births can be considered genocide, and transferring children out of one group into another group for indoctrination also is a form of genocide. So the Genocide Convention went into full force in January of 1951. There was 152 state parties that signed off on this, and the United States was one of the first nation states to sign off on the Genocide Convention. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the typologies of genocide. Typologies basically are different ways to describe genocide, but essentially, it's genocide. So scholars of genocide tend to use broader definitions than found in international law, and that are these typologies. So let's go over them. The first one is known as politicide. And politicide is when governments try to squash oppositions that poses threats to their power relations within the state. People are killed who oppose the government. The next form or typology of genocide is known as hegemonial genocide. And this is basically killing enough members to break capacity to resist or force assimilations of groups during the consolidation of power. So if one uh, country invades another country trying to take over that country, if they kill enough people to weaken that invaded country's capacity to resist, and then force them to assimilate into their culture, that's known as hegemonial genocide. Then you have despotic genocide. And despotic genocide is the clearing away of opponents. So you really see despotic genocide in like disappearances of political opponents. You can also see it culturally with forced assimilation. And then you have what's known as violent latent genocide. And violent latent is really a byproduct, or it's a form of genocide that is a byproduct of another operation. So you see this a lot with like native populations and when people invade countries. So think of the Indians, Native Americans, whenever our ancestors came over and started colonial America. We really had some violent, latent genocide, if you think about it, um, along with some hegemonial genocide going on, moving them, making them go to uh, reserves and kind of the whole Trail of Tears and things like that. So there's also something called utilitarian genocide. And utilitarian genocide is done to achieve some other goal, like a population reduction. Often in the context of colonialism, territory was seized in order to gain control of economic resources for cultural exploitation. Um, so remember, utilitarianism is really the greater good. And so there have been times like Hitler tried to use the Holocaust as a utilitarian uh, effect, saying that the annihilation of the Jews was for the greater good of humanity. You also have xenophobic genocide, which is the elimination of offending groups because they're unfamiliar, perhaps different religion, ethnicity, or culture. You have ideological genocide, where you identify a group unworthy of living. And then you have retribute, words are hard, retributive, retributive. I'll get it there eventually. Um, think retribution. So, retributive genocide is a violent exchange between two groups rooted in historical resentment. So, you're going to be watching a video on Rwanda this week. And Rwanda really was retributive genocide. And you're going to see kind of why the population was annihilated the way it was, and kind of see some of these typologies, how they overlap. So, why does genocide happen? Well, scholars have looked at different levels of explanation, but we're going to focus on what are called macro level explanations. And macro level explanations is really looking at the whole, big picture, not focusing in on just one or two um, genocide events, but looking at a whole. And the first explanation that we come up with is regime types. Although some criminologists discount regime type, totalitarian states are more vulnerable to genocide, in part because they lack checks and balances. Um, there's no dissenters to suggest that genocide is bad in totalitarian states, so genocide happens. The lack of democratic institutions also um, increased the likelihood that genocide could happen. And it also suggests a weakened or underdeveloped civic society. So, again, it's that fewer checks on power um, with the regime type. And the explanation of regime type is basically um, genocide happens, remember, to keep those dissenters or those deemed less than from overthrowing the power, those in power. So another explanation is international relations. You have something known as the democratic peace theory. And the democratic peace theory basically states that democracies are less likely to engage in genocide. In a world of global interdependence and strong institutional constraints on decision making, it becomes more difficult for such governments to use force, particularly when other democracies are involved. Also, shared norms make it likely democracies will not conflict with one another and will bow to expectations of other countries. Not only does this influence how they respond to other countries, but also how they respond to and interact with their own citizenry. This theory was developed in terms of modern states when democracy has become the standard regime type for states with modern market economies. Outside of this context, we start seeing potential problems. So, like the US committed genocide against the Native Americans, some of whom uh, had more established democratic traditions than the US at the time. So, you also have a, um, a thought that international openness or isolation can cause genocide. And that premise is basically state that the more open a society is, the less vulnerable they are to genocide, as crimes are more likely to be exposed and states are more susceptible to international pressure exposure. The less open, the more vulnerable. And again, isolation increases vulnerability. So, another thought for why genocide happens is known as functionalism. And think of it this way: when crisis brings the collapse of social structures, social cohesions, and consensus is undermined. If one group is able to maintain their cohesion, they may develop a sense of collective efficacy. Under an, anomy, under anomy, they are likely, and we'll talk about anomy here in a minute. Um, they're likely to create alternative cultures with new norms and values that are more radical and susceptible to messages of hate. Um, so let's talk about anomy for a minute. And anomy, however you say it, is a criminology term. And it basically means that there's some type of stress that is introduced into the environment that creates chaos. So the anomy explanation says that major disruptions can cause genocide, like wars, revolutions, or world orders, uh, superpower dominances, things like that can all increase anomy. When states fail, you also see um, more genocide and more civil unrest. Germany is sometimes seen as the exception, but this overlooks the fact that the context for the rise of Hitler was a substantially weakened state and struggling interwar democracy. Trying to see. And I think that's all we're going to do on those. So now that we've looked at the typologies of genocide and we've looked at some explanations for why genocide occurs, let's look at some perpetrator and victim characteristics. So act, let's start with perpetrators. Typically, the action of genocide occurs during periods of upheaval. So remember, anomic conditions, either war or large scale social change, decolonization, those type of things lend it perpetrators more opportunity to commit genocide. Perpetrators tend to be agitated. There tends to be some uncertainty and instability, and their actions may likely go unnoticed because perpetrators believed they could act without accountability and enjoy the spoils of their efforts. We will talk about the radicalization process here in just a minute, but perpetrators typically utilize scapegoating to rally people to their cause. And so by scapegoating, it allows them to have a them to target. So let's look at some victim characteristics. Victims tend to live in the same territory as perpetrators. They are, however, very vulnerable. They're a less powerful group and they're not likely to fight back. They tend to be a lot more passive. Um, they typically are caught off guard. Um, there was not out of the ordinary conflict sometimes during genocide. So they may ignore certain signs of potential genocide that you can see in hindsight, but they're just so used to those conditions. And another characteristic of the victims is they lacked guardians. So there was no group or identified groups to protect them. And so it made them easy targets for the perpetrators. International response to genocide is an evolving aspect of genocide. And so we see that as awareness has increased, we've talked about it through this lecture. The laws, international laws, have developed. The Genocide Convention was signed, and you see more pressure from the international community to do and step in. Remember that responsibility to protect that the UN signed in 2005. Um, the International Criminal Court is more empowered to hold perpetrators and states accountable for genocidal effects or genocidal actions that they perpetrate. And finally, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about systematic indoctrination. And you have an article that you will have read this week that does a fantastic job of really talking about how people become indoctrinated to commit genocide. Because after all, we talk about genocide and we think, why would anyone do this? Well, there are scholars who have spent substantial amounts of time trying to understand this behavior. And this week you read about 6 steps to systematic indoctrination. And the first step is recruitment. And in the recruitment step, um, that is where we see the vulnerable being recruited to the effort. So there are certain characteristics of people who tend to um, follow and fall into um, movements violence movements. The the people who tend to fall into these movements tend to be young. They tend to be male. They typically have some sort of shared ideology, and they have a strong respect for authority, and they have a very strong respect for hierarchy. We have seen, I have studied systematic indoctrination in my graduate studies, and in terms of hate crimes go, and it's fascinating to see um, recruitment in the military, recruitment in law enforcement, recruitment in those paramilitary organizations who have already had it ingrained in them not to question. On the flip side of that, you see um, younger males, typically from broken homes, looking for places to fit in, low self esteem, looking for their niche, are more susceptible to be recruited into like the hate movements and things like that. So then the second step is training. And training is the actual indoctrination aspect. Um, you have read that an interesting part of the training is um, pairing people together to create relationships. Because with relationships, it's far less likely that someone will leave when they realize the atrocities that they're committing in the name of whatever movement they're in, because they have relationships with these people. They have relationships that kind of hold them accountable. In criminology, we have a social learning theory, and really kind of your social learning theory comes into the training aspect of this as well, just because um, this phase is them learning to hate, learning the the leaders of these movements typically um, teach these people who to hate, why to hate them, utilizing scapegoating methodologies and things like that. And then you have authorization. Authorization can either be transcendent or mundane, and this is really about desensitization. Desensitization is basically um, either focusing on the outcome and not necessarily focusing on the process. That's transcendent authorization. Or um, desensitizing the person from violence in and of itself, which is mundane authorization. So we talked also about characteristics of people who tend to join these type of organizations. They have a strong respect for authority. So you have a term called bureaucracy. And you hear bureaucracy when you study government a lot. And that's our hierarchies and ways to keep movements and keep governments functioning, even when there's consistent leadership changes. So, this bureaucracy teaches people their place in the organization and teaches them not to question their place in the organization and just do the job that's prescribed to them. Isolation is a huge component of systematic indoctrination. Um, Isolation can be physical isolation or it can be social isolation. So we talked about in the training section that you typically pair people together so that they form those relationships. Well, in organizations that truly utilize the systematic indoctrination methodology, they isolate those individuals from any outside relationships, sources, anything like that. Think cults. And so all the interactions they get, all the messaging that they get, all of the way that their brain is being wired is through the messaging of group interplay. And they don't get to hear consistent messaging of questioning what they're hearing and questioning what they're being taught from the outside because they don't have any interactions with the outside. And then finally, the final step is dehumanization. And dehumanization is the fundamental way to numb consciousness in actors. So this is when Hitler explained that the Jews aren't deserving to live, that um, they are less than, that they are the reason why the Nazi Party and the members of the Nazi Party are having so many economic hardships and things like that. So you dehumanize your intended victims so that when you have to commit the atrocious acts that you have to commit, you don't think about those atrocious acts. So all six of these together make up the method of systematic indoctrination. You can read more about this in the handout. You should read more about this in the handout. Um, that is going to conclude the lesson for this week. The deep dive into genocide. You have some videos that you're going to have to watch. You're going to watch the video on Rwanda and the genocide in Rwanda, and your reaction paper is actually going to be done this week in lieu of a discussion board. So I hope you all have a great week. If you need me, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Have a good week.